Hello Internet, welcome to ComixRX. I am MD Rhys and I'm here to diagnose the things I see wrong with problems and prescribe solutions. And today you might notice is a little different from my other videos. I am in fact in the official MD garb. Mr. Doug Ernst gave me a piece of advice when I was first starting my channel. He said, "You've got a name, you've got a gimmick, I'd like to see more of that." And keeping in mind what Diversity in Comics once said, is to stick with your bit. I say, this seems like a pretty decent bit. So I've got myself my little identification badge, my implements of the trade, and the appropriate attire. So let's dig in. Today we are going to talk about PlasticMan #1 by Gail Simone. But before we can start about talking about that, we need to discuss a little bit about PlasticMan himself. Talk about why he matters and how did Gail do hitting the points that make a PlasticMan story PlasticMan. So I'm gonna lean back in the old MD chair for a second and wax a little philosophical, if you don't mind. So Jack Cole, who was a brilliant but troubled man, invented PlasticMan way back in Police Comics, 1941 if I remember right. I'm not looking that up, so tell me if I'm wrong down in the comments. Anyway, PlasticMan began his life, of course, as a criminal who was injured in a heist at a chemical factory and ended up being rescued by some monks. Due to the kindness of the monks and the harshness of his upbringing beforehand, he decided to change his life, make a new start, become something bigger than himself. And so he became a superhero. Conveniently, he was wearing some kind of get-up, circus performer type of outfit, and he ends up being able to shape-shift into anything with your 3 or 4 basic PlasticMan colors. Like I said, 5, white and black, Caucasian skin tone, red, yellow, and I guess red and yellow, that's it. So anyway, point being is the gimmick was always PlasticMan's a lamp with a belt, or a trash can with goggles, or something along those lines. So in his stories, Jack Cole was able to find this middle line between comedy and serious subject matter. There'd be murder, there'd be kidnapping, there'd be assault, but it was still really funny, not unlike what Will Eisner did with the spirit stuff. Sometimes heavier than others, but there you have it. So that was sort of PlasticMan's shtick. PlasticMan was published by Dadgummit. Police Comics was owned by, oh man, I'm going to forget the name of it. It wasn't Fawcett. Quality Comics. That's the one. They actually had a license to publish Spirit for a while, Eisner, and Eisner made a bunch of other comics for Quality. The Blackhawks were Quality Comics. Phantom Lady, of course. A whole bunch of others, right? In fact, many years later, DC ended up buying the Quality characters, and they became the Freedom Fighters, Uncle Sam, and Miss America, and the Human Bomb, and all those guys. And PlasticMan was one of those. But DC didn't realize at first that they'd purchased PlasticMan. So he had a gap in time when he was published between a little bit before Jack Cole sadly took his own life, and then almost, I think, 20 years later till he first appeared in DC Comics in Dial H for Hero as one of the forms that the Dial H crew took. Not going to get into that right now, but then he started showing up in those Earth 4 stories from the against the crossovers between the Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth 4, and blah, 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 blah. And PlasticMan was a facet in some of those tales later on, and he had guest appearances in World's Finest, and he showed up occasionally in other titles too. So, well, when DC, not to get too much into the weeds, but when DC relaunched their universe with the Crisis and combined all their various universes into a single history, my understanding is the original plan was to leave PlasticMan in the 40s and make him somebody who didn't age, right? But that wasn't always the way he was written, and the first Plastic Man solo story that was written post-crisis was the Plastic Man miniseries written by Phil Foglio. And Phil brought his origin up to the modern era. And so you would have, from then up until the early 20-aughts, there'd be some people that would write Plastic Man with a Golden Age origin, and some people that would write Plastic Man with a Modern Age origin, and some people that would just ignore it altogether and just do whatever they wanted with it. Probably the best Plastic Man series so far, since the original, would be Kyle Baker's that ran in the early 21st century, right? I did not dig the numbers on all that out, but you can look it up. It's brilliant stuff. Great, funny, good satire, really good jokes. Do a good job of seeming some serious stuff in there. Now, Plastic Man did show up in Justice League very heavily, and there was some really fun stuff in the Justice League title with him being a real hero's hero, in addition to being silly. Don't want to dog on any of that at all, but the Kyle Baker's Plastic Man series is unquestionably the best. Actually, I suppose there's not, you could always question it, but it was pure fun. It was just a great time to be had by all. So, one of the things that we have to look at when you're dealing with the Plastic Man character is he has a very tragic origin. He's a criminal who ended up being nearly killed and comes back from it, right? But he doesn't let his tragic backstory dictate him at all. The other thing about Plastic Man's story that's very different is that he went from being a mobster, being a second story man, into being an agent, a special agent for the Central Bureau of Intelligence or the National Bureau of Investigation, depending on which group of stories you're telling. And that's something that's also very interesting and worth paying attention to. For the side note, I actually prefer the idea that both Plastic Man and Woozy Winks, his immortal and imperishable sidekick, have a Golden Age origin, and so we've just been seeing them over the course of the last almost 100 years, just going through different kinds of stuff. In fact, back in my days working in fanzine, I'd actually put together a pitch to, I was going to try to send to DC about Plastic Man having a whole history that was contiguous all the way through and tying in all the different projects together, including the cartoon series. Never got that finished. And DC doesn't return my phone calls anyway, so what do you do? So anyway, it's been 5 minutes of history and introductions, so let's dig into this book and see what we have for there. Now, one thing I want to also point out is I'll tell you right off the cover, I really love this cover. It's silly, it's tragic, it's very much Plastic Man. The artist has got a really good hint of flavor for that. The biggest thing I have a problem with is it's a scene that we start with, actually, but it's misleading for those of us who are fans of the Baker series, where Plastic Man actually ends up reconnecting with his old girl from back in the bad old days, who has herself become a law enforcement officer, and Plas has been a renegade hero for a while, just living on the fringes. It was fun stuff, man. I can't even get into that. But this is not her, although the body type and the look could be, but it's not. So it was a little bit of a mislead. I'd rather have seen it being a brunette on the cover, since she doesn't matter to the story anyway. So here we start off right here with this gorgeous splash page. Let's try to get this without the glare on it. And E.L. O'Brien is about to have the crap kicked out of him by these other mobsters, which are his old associates. Now, why do they want to beat him up, right? It turns out the only reason they want to beat him up is that he's not dead anymore. And it goes on here talking a little bit about the caper. And basically there was a theft at some chemical plant, and it went south, and a cop got shot, and Eel got shot, and he got covered in chemicals, and then they dispose of his body. That's going on a little bit later. So Eel is back for vengeance. And that's his whole point. And his starting with vengeance is by getting the crap mercilessly kicked out of him, and making some very inappropriate comments about prophylactics. I'm not going to go into that, but it makes it real gritty and dingy, and it makes it so that in a few pages it's going to feel really uncomfortable. I'll show you that here in a second too. So Eel gets the crap kicked out of him, and then he's accosted, not really accosted. The mobsters go on about their business, and this street urchin shows up, and I'm just going to read this to you. If you've seen any of the other YouTubers talking about this, I'm sure they have, but this is worth reading because it's bizarre. And I want to point out how uncomfortable it is. So we've just seen a man savagely beaten. He's got some spunk, but he's been savagely beaten, which is kind of a lot for a PlasticMan book. So then PlasticMan laying on the ground in a puddle of his own blood, and he's in his E.L. O'Brien form. He has not been revealed yet that it's PlasticMan, but if you are aware of it, they call him by name, so it's obvious who it is if you've ever paid attention to the series, to the story before, which is important. Anyway, getting on with it. So the street kid walks up to him and said, "Those guys beat the censored out of you." And it actually is the censored marks there. You can see that. So I'm just going to call it that. That was so Wang. Wang. Now, in my real life, I work with teenagers. I talk to teenagers. I've never heard teenagers use the term Wang as an adjective. I've heard it being used as a nominative several times, but never as an adjective, and that's strange. And then the boy asks, "Do you need an ambulance?" And Eel says, "No." And the boy says, "What's your name?" And Eel says, "Eel." The boy says, "I'm Pato, Suave Pato Swakatoon, Prince of Pine Street." Now, that phrasing is really fun. And I'll tell you why, because it harkens back to the romance in 1940s comics of street kids that had their names and their lingos and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not an expert in street kids at the time, so I don't know how accurate those things are, but anytime there's a gang of urchins, they have crazy and wild names that they give themselves to lead to their importance. And so that is endearing, but then this kid just shows out, just takes off, right? First, before he takes off, he says, "3 guys on one, that's just Wang. I'll see you around, E.L. O'Brien," which maybe we will. Maybe he'll show up as a side character in subsequent issues. It's a 6-issue miniseries, so who knows, right? And then Eel says, "Is Wang good or bad? Does it still mean penis?" We have to have that. Can't lay it under the table, can't put it between the lines. It's got to be up front with that. And that is crazy. I don't understand that, because it actually makes it less funny. Then he starts singing a butchered song and ends up revealing, of course, that he's PlasticMan. And this quite a fun page of this reveal, right? He starts taking off the old suit, puts on the goggles, and boom, he's gone, right? Now we have all of this ridiculously silly art that's showing up here, being a rubber bouncing ball bouncing through the city. And it actually took me a couple of looks over this page to figure out what's going on. Then Eel recounts his last memories and explains why he's hunting these guys down, because he wants some vengeance. So he goes after one of his fellows, terrifying them to death, trying to get answers. And the man says that is Eel, who killed the guard in their last robbery, and that puts a dark shadow on everything. And then there's a whole page of wastedness. Eel talking to ladies at the gentleman's club he works at. Then he goes to sleep and remembers the events more clearly, remembers the acids eating him away, and a fairly dark page that's full of some pretty graphic imagery, once again. Right? But, once again, it's a crime story. It's not necessarily out of place, except that it's a Plastic Man story. So just 2 pages later, Eel is awoken from his dream, from his reminiscences, by a secret agent of Spiral, where there's all kinds of awkward Eel sleeps in the nude jokes. And it's awkward because he's very fit and she finds him attractive, and it's awkward because he's a shapeshifter and can change his body around, and there's several slight jokes about that. And it's just strange because it doesn't have that edge that the other pages have it, and it's not really silly either. It's a very adult humor, and it's very uncomfortable. Now, Eel has just been beaten, if you remember, by his friends, right? And he's recovered from all of that and gone on. And the spy lady has gotten his attention because she needs an operative to get in to a secret intergovernmental cabal of bad guys. Seems kind of like the whole Hydra situation from Captain America, right? Where there's these agents that are taking over the government. And, well, in telling all of this, Plastic Man says, you're so full of wang. What the hell? Anyway, Plastic Man gets a call after hearing of all this from one of his former friends who just tried to kill him, who is reaching out to Eel for safety. Eel goes to investigate, and his buddy, who's not quite dead. Also, side note, Eel has transformed himself into a car. That's where he gets across town. That's not how his powers work. You don't want to get onto that, but that's not how they work. It's far too complex a machine for Plastic Man to transform into. Anyway, he's gone. His buddy has gone across town. You'll see, and he's gone across town to his buddy. His buddy's lying in a pool of his own blood. He says, "Who did this to you?" He writes JLA on the wall, and then Plastic Man decides he's going to figure out what's going on. But before he can investigate any further, SWAT teams show up, bada bing, bada boom, right? So, that's a decent setup for a miniseries. There's a lot of mystery going on. I'm definitely going to be picking up the second issue because I'm very curious about how they're going to take this. The idea about Plastic Man as an outsider being brought in to investigate an intergovernmental cabal, which may have infiltrated all of the major super teams, that seems kind of fun. And I like the idea of Plastic Man investigating because that was a big part of his piece in Police Comics. In fact, Ralph Dibny, the elongated man, the ductile detective, one of my favorite characters, was inspired by Plastic Man, and Julie Schwartz, I believe it was Julie Schwartz, created him not realizing DC already owned the rights to Plastic Man. Now, Dibny's powers are different, his setup is different, he's a better investigator, and that's important, but I still love seeing Plas as an investigator, especially somebody who's been a criminal, who's taken the other side of that. That's just a really fun take. But here's where the problem is. The setup is interesting, the miniseries might be interesting, but this issue sucks. And let me explain why. First of all, it's not consistent in tone, right? And I'm not the first person to point this out, but it's not. It doesn't know if it wants to be goofy. It doesn't know if it wants to be gritty. It doesn't know if it wants to be for kids. It doesn't know if it wants to be for adults. It's just a bunch of crap that's been thrown on there in a long weekend. Maybe even a long afternoon. It's not well put together. Another thing that's very odd about it is the time frame in it. Okay? So, in any case, if you're looking at Plastic Man's story, Golden Age origin, Modern Age origin, right? There's a gap of time between when anyone had heard of Plastic Man and when E.L. O'Brien was quote-unquote killed. Okay? There's a gap in time. And typically, it's filled in with his time at the monastery and the reorienting of his moral self, right? Believe it was Mark Waid writing him in the Man or Superman arc in, I think it was Man or Superman it was called, arc back in the early aughts. where the superheroes and their civilian identities were split between them from some sort of magic or something. I don't remember exactly what it was. And Eel struggled because his heroic identity was Plastic Man, and Eel O'Brien had been a snake. And he didn't want to be a snake anymore. He wanted to be something different. It was really interesting things because Eel, though raised Irish Catholic, had abandoned all of that for the sake of his own wealth, right? For the sake of his own self-aggrandizement. And so then in his repentance, he is born anew as Plastic Man, baptized in the chemicals, so to speak, right? To use a little bit of overtly religious imagery. There's none of that in this, right? His only motivation to be Plastic Man seems to be vengeance, right? And then when vengeance is unplaced, he has no moral footing anymore, except for the attractive dark-skinned woman who wakes him up naked one day, okay? So that doesn't really, that's an odd place to go with it. The other thing that's strange is he specifically says the last thing he remembers is dying, right? This page with the funny ball. Let me read you his dialogue. See, it's true they really were we really were friends, but then something happened and I don't really remember it all. I remember dying, but I came back. And until I know what happened, no one can know Eel O'Brien is really Plastic Man. Now he says both of those things like they have some weight. No one can know Eel O'Brien is Plastic Man. That implies that they both matter to the general public. Why would he care about protecting his secret identity if he didn't have a regular identity, a superhero identity to maintain? The second thing that's weird about it is that if he's dead, if he's just Plastic Man, no one knows about Eel O'Brien. There are other ways you could get information, so it seems unnecessary. The whole thing doesn't make sense. It's not like he needs his Eel O'Brien identity, but in his Eel O'Brien identity, he's just some lout who works security at a strip club that his buddy owns. And it's a superhero-themed strip club. It just doesn't seem like, he could be anyone. He doesn't need to eat. He doesn't need to sleep. His body chemistry's been massively changed. He's immortal. Those are all things we know from the pre-52 universe. And of course, we're dealing here in the Rebirth universe, but those things are pretty well standard part of the Plastic Man package. And in fact, if you're reading the Terrifics, and you should be, Plastic Man in that is pretty much identical to the Plastic Man in every other incarnation, which I'm assuming is the same one here. I'm also assuming this is probably supposed to be a prequel to all of the current universe, but it doesn't say that, and the time frame doesn't make sense. The other thing is that if Plastic Man is a non-entity, right? If his origin just happened, and Plastic Man is a big mystery, then there's no reason for the spiral agent, thank you, for the spiral agent to seek him out. That's a non-thing. And yet, because you have to be an unknown person to even be at all dependable, right? To fit into there. He can be an outsider, still be known. If he's unknown, he's going to be off the radar. But if he's got a really well-documented history where people would know about Plastic Man, then he's probably also suspect to be part of this evil cabal they're talking about here. So the time frame of the story doesn't really make sense. Now that doesn't mean the story is terribly bad. Gail Simone has kind of a habit of telling interesting stories with poor characters. So let's find out how it goes, and I'm up for following the trail a little bit, but it's still a little strange. Anyway, this video is going to be about 30 minutes. It's a long time to talk about Plastic Man, but I don't think I can cut anything out of it. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time, and I hope you're going to follow me as I keep going along with talking about comics. This one, I really think it suffers from a multiple personality problem, and we'll see if it's able to help itself along by knowing its own boundaries and future issues. This has been Rhys with MD Rhys with ComixRX, and I hope to catch you guys next time.